There is a mountain on a world called Vaelthar that nobody visits anymore. Not because it is dangerous, not because it is forbidden. The authorities tried putting up restrictions once, early in the recovery period, and the locals simply walked around the barriers and kept going anyway. They didn't do it out of defiance. They did it because they felt something pulling them there. A weight in the chest. A kind of gravity that had nothing to do with physics. The mountain is called Grayspan by the humans who live in the settlements below it. The older species, the Valdrath, the Serenki, the archived voices of the Lorethian scholars, call it something that doesn't translate cleanly into any language spoken today. The closest approximation in Standard Galactic is something like the place where the old world held its breath. At the base of that mountain, inside a hollow carved not by erosion, but by the weight of an enormous body settling into the earth over 10,000 years, there is a nest. It is not a nest in the way birds build nests. It is a depression in the stone, shaped like a crater, lined with scales the size of wagon wheels that fell off naturally during molting cycles that haven't happened in centuries. The scales are black and silver, and they catch the light differently depending on the time of day. In the morning they look like embers cooling. At dusk they look like stars embedded in the rock. That nest belonged to Ethan Verk, last of the Grayspan line. He was 4,012 years old when a 12-year-old human boy named Cale Dunmore found him dying there. This is the documented record of what happened next. I need you to understand something about my son before I tell you any of this, because if you don't understand what kind of boy he was, none of it will make sense to you. Cale was not a fearless child. I want to be very clear about that. He was afraid of plenty of things. He was afraid of the dark until he was 9. He had nightmares about falling, real bad ones, where he'd wake up gasping and come find me in the kitchen at 3 in the morning and just stand there shaking until I gave him a cup of warm grain broth. He was afraid of the ore processing drones that came through the settlement every harvest cycle, the ones that moved on 6 articulated legs and made a sound like grinding teeth. He'd hide behind the water barrel when he heard them coming. He was a nervous boy in a lot of ways. But here's the thing about Cale, the thing that made him different. He was afraid of things, yes, but he was never, ever able to walk away from something that needed help. When he was 6, he found a wounded marsh crawler, that's a local creature, looks a bit like a lizard but with translucent membrane wings, on the path behind our house. Thing was hissing and snapping at everything that came near it. Our neighbor's older son went up to it with a stick, said he was going to put it out of its misery. Cale pushed him away, 6 years old pushing a 14-year-old, got knocked flat for it, got up, kept standing between that boy and the crawler. I watched from the window. I didn't intervene. I probably should have, but I couldn't. I needed to see what he was going to do. He sat down next to that creature, right on the dirt, didn't try to touch it, didn't talk to it, just sat there, for 4 hours. I brought him dinner at the path because he refused to come inside. He sat there until the creature stopped hissing. Then he built it a little shelter from branches and checked on it every day for 2 weeks until it was strong enough to fly away. He was 6. So when I tell you what he did on Grayspan, I need you to know it was consistent with who he was. It wasn't a sudden act of bravery. It wasn't a miracle from nowhere. It was Cale being Cale, the same as he always was, just on a very different scale. Field recording transcript, personal log of Cale Dunmore. Note, recording begins mid-sentence, previous content not recoverable. And I wasn't supposed to go up past the second ridge. Mum had said specifically the second ridge. The survey drones go up to the third, but they come back weird sometimes, with corrupted data or just stopped, hovering in the same spot, like they've hit a wall in the air. The tech guys from the settlement came out twice to look at it. First time they said it was magnetic interference from the ore deposits. Second time they said probably the same thing, but they didn't sound sure. I'd been up to the second ridge maybe 50 times. I knew every rock. I knew where the frost moss grew thick in the mornings and where it didn't grow at all. I knew where you could sometimes see the lights from the eastern stations blinking through the cloud cover if you were there at exactly the right time. I was up there looking for survey markers. There was a school project. I don't need to explain the whole thing, but basically I needed to document 3 environmental monitoring stations for my settlement geography assignment, and 2 of them were up in the approved zone, but one of them, the one I really needed for the full marks, was just over the ridge into the unauthorized area. Just over, like barely. You could practically see it from the approved side if the weather was clear. The weather wasn't clear. The cloud cover had come down overnight and the whole mountain was wrapped in this low gray mist that made everything feel muffled. Sound didn't carry right. My own footsteps sounded far away. I crossed the ridge marker, the old stone post that's been there since before the settlement was established, worn down to a nub, and I just went a bit further. Just a bit. Maybe 60 meters. I found the monitoring station, logged it, started heading back. And then I heard it. Not a sound exactly. More like, you know how you can feel pressure change before a storm, like your ears adjust and everything goes slightly flat. It was like that but localized, like the pressure was coming from a specific direction, from lower down the slope toward the hollow. I've thought about this moment a lot, trying to figure out why I went toward it instead of away. The honest answer is I don't fully know. Part of it was curiosity. Part of it was that feeling, the chest weight feeling everyone talks about with the mountain. But the biggest part of it, if I'm being honest, was that whatever the sensation was, it felt like pain. Not my pain, not physical pain, something broader. Like grief broadcast on a frequency the whole body picks up without understanding. I went down toward the hollow. Written account Cale Dunmore. The hollow was bigger than I'd expected. I'd heard people talk about it. Everybody in the settlement has heard about the hollow, the same way you've heard about a famous building in another city, but none of us had actually been there, or at least no one admitted to it, and I'd always imagined it as more cave-like. Dark, enclosed. It was open to the sky. A wide depression, maybe 40 meters across, with walls of gray-black stone rising up around it in a rough circle. The scales on the floor caught what little light was coming through the clouds and scattered it in a way that made the whole space look like it was lit from within. And at the center of it, coiled like a mountain that had decided to become an animal, was Ethon. I didn't know his name then. I didn't know anything, really. I just saw a dragon. Here's what I actually saw, specifically, because I know the clinical descriptions in the GPA files are different from how it actually looks to a person standing there. He was enormous. I know the measurements now, 418 meters from snout to tail, the longest of the Gracespan line on record. But measurements don't communicate what enormous actually feels like when you're 12 and you're standing at the edge of something, and looking at a creature that makes the hollow feel small. His scales were, I want to say black, but that's not right. They were the color of deep water at night. Where the light caught them they went silver, almost white, and in the shadows between the scales the color was something I don't have a word for, something older than black. His eyes were closed. He was breathing, but barely. Long, slow, stretched-out intervals between each breath, like a machine running on reserves it barely had. Each exhale sent a thin curl of smoke into the air that dispersed almost immediately. Not fire, just warmth leaving a body that couldn't keep it in. Around the edges of his form, and this is the part that got me the most, the part I keep coming back to, there were places where his scales had pulled away. Not cleanly, not shed, but crumbling, like old stone, like the mountain itself was reclaiming him slowly, particle by particle. Where the scales had crumbled, the skin underneath was translucent, and beneath the skin you could see a faint pulse, irregular and slow, like a heartbeat trying to remember its own rhythm. I stood at the rim of the hollow for a long time. Then I climbed down. Filed with case dossier GPA 7741. When I reviewed Cale Dunmore's initial account of his approach to the subject, my first instinct, the clinical one, was to flag it as potentially embellished. Children tend to reconstruct emotional significance in hindsight, reading back into memories feelings they've acquired since. It's not dishonesty. It's just how human memory works. Then I reviewed the footage from his communicator. The device had automatically activated its environmental sensor suite when it detected the pressure differential. The full recording is 62 minutes of uninterrupted documentation. I've watched it dozens of times, and every time I come away with the same feeling. This is one of the most significant pieces of footage in the HFY archive, and it was captured on a school-grade communicator by a 12-year-old who was technically truant. The first minutes of the recording show the hollow from above, and what's immediately obvious is that the visual effect Cale describes, the internal luminescence, the quality of light in the scales, is real. It's not a trick of memory. The scales of Ethan Verk in his final decline were undergoing a phenomenon that our xenobiologists eventually documented as terminal radiance. It's a poorly understood process, specific to the grayspine dragon line, in which the bioluminescent compounds that run through the dragon's integument gradually migrate to the scale surface as the body's regulatory systems shut down. It is, in simple terms, the creature's light rising to the surface as the center goes dark. It is, I will say on the record, one of the most beautiful and heartbreaking things I have ever seen documented. The boy climbs down into the hollow. You can hear his breathing on the audio, faster than normal, shallow, the breathing of someone moving carefully through something that frightens them. His footsteps on the scales are soft. He's trying not to make noise. He gets close. Closer than any non-dragon entity had come to Ethan in 300 years, according to our historical cross-referencing. He stops about 8 meters from the dragon's nearest coil, the tail, specifically, which in itself is approximately 12 meters in diameter at that point, and just stands there. On the recording, you can hear the dragon's breath, the intervals between. Cale Dunmore doesn't run. He doesn't freeze in the way we typically see fear response in humans, the rigid stillness, the held breath. Instead, he does something I've seen him do in later footage as well, in situations that stress him. He sits down, just lowers himself to the ground, cross-legged, and sits. And then he says, very quietly, in a voice that doesn't shake nearly as much as I'd expect from anyone in that situation. Hey, I can see you're not doing great. I'm not going to bother you. I don't think you should be alone. Oral history, Bren Coulter, Settlement Elder, Asheville Lower. Recorded by GPA correspondent Surin Oliveth. People ask me sometimes what I know about the old stories, about the grayspine dragons. I'll tell you what my grandmother told me and her grandmother told her. Take it for what it is, oral tradition, not verified history. The grayspine dragons were the first inhabitants of Vaelthar. Before the settlement, ships came, before the survey drones, before any of us. They were here when the planet was still cooling, or so the story goes. They didn't build anything, didn't need to. They were the civilization. Not in the way we think of civilization, not with cities and governance and economic systems. They had something older, a consciousness that ran not just through each individual dragon but between them, like a network, like the root systems of ancient trees that are technically separate plants but share everything underground. They called it the Verk. That's where Ethan's family name comes from. The Verk was not just their culture, it was their memory, their continuity. Every grayspine dragon carried the accumulated experience of every dragon who had lived before them, not as knowledge exactly, more like bodily knowledge, the way you know how to breathe without thinking. They knew how their ancestors had thought, how they'd felt. It lived in them. When the last female of the line died, Soratha Verk, about 600 years before Cale's time, something in the network broke. It couldn't sustain with only one carrier. and Ethan spent the next 6 centuries carrying all of it alone. The memories of 10,000 years of his people, with no one to share them with. My grandmother said the old scholars believed that was what was killing him. Not disease, not age, though age played its part. Grief, she said, the particular grief of being the last of something. I don't know if you can die of grief. I suppose the medical records will say something different. But that's the story I was told. And when I heard what Cale Dunmore did what he said, sitting there at the edge of that hollow, the first thing I thought was, of course it was a human child who stayed. Of course it was a human who said, you shouldn't be alone. We're stubborn that way, even when we shouldn't be, maybe especially then. Continued, recorded log of Cale Dunmore. Day 14, third moon continuation. He opened his eyes. I need to stop here because I've told this part to maybe 30 different people by now, and every time I get to this part, I find that I haven't actually prepared myself to tell it, even though you'd think by the 40th time you'd be ready. His eyes were gold. Not a color that you'd naturally compare to gold the way people say eyes are hazel or green. Actual deep burning gold, like looking at something that produces its own light. And they were large. I mean, obviously, proportionally, they had to be, but large in a way that was more than scale. The way they moved when he focused on me, very slowly, tracking me with the deliberate patience of something that has all the time in the world and also no time left at all. That precision of motion was the thing that hit me most. He saw me. He didn't react. No flinch, no sound, no change in the cadence of his breathing. He just looked at me, for a long time. I didn't move. I'd learned that much from the marsh crawler. Don't move suddenly. Don't fill the space with noise or action. Let the thing decide what you are before you give it any more information. Then the voice came. Not from his mouth. Not sound exactly. More like the pressure differential I'd felt at the ridge, but shaped, given meaning, like the mountain itself was forming words. It said, you are very small to be here alone. I said, so are you, kind of. Which was, I know. It's a ridiculous thing to say to a 400-meter dragon, but I was 12 and I was terrified, and that's what came out. There was a long pause. And then, I will swear to this for the rest of my life, there was a sound. Not quite laughter. Something older than laughter, something that laughter might have been descended from. A low resonance that I felt in my sternum more than I heard it with my ears. The voice came again. Sit, small thing. If you are going to stay, sit. I was already sitting. I told him that. Another pause. So you are, he said. Post-intervention analysis, filed with case dossier. When our team finally gained access to the hollow, 63 days after Cale Dunmore's first entry, and conducted our initial biometric assessment of Ethan Verk, the physiological picture was unambiguous. The subject was in the final stage of what we now classify as Gracefine lineage decline. It is not a disease. It does not have a pathological origin in the way human or standard species illness does. It is, as accurately as we can describe it, a systemic disengagement. The biological systems of a gracespine dragon are not independent of one another in the way most species organs are. They function as a unified network, cardiovascular, neurological, respiratory, integumentary, all linked through the bioluminescent compound we've designated Verkite. Verkite is, among other things, what carries the Verk, the memory network, the ancestral continuity. When Ethan lost his last kin, the Verkite network had no external distribution point, no other body to connect to. Our working hypothesis, and it remains a hypothesis because we still do not fully understand the compound, is that the accumulated weight of an unshared network this extensive creates what we can only call biological pressure. The compound builds, concentrated with nowhere to go, and the systems that produce it begin to fail under the load. He was, in the simplest terms, drowning in his own memory. In the 600 years he'd spent as the last carrier of the Werk. His cardiovascular output at first assessment was at approximately 11% of baseline capacity for a grayspine dragon his age. His respiratory function was operating on a compensatory cycle, meaning his body had rerouted resources from several non-essential biological systems to maintain minimal breathing. The terminal radiance was advanced to a degree our preliminary models suggested would precede death by approximately 3 to 8 days. That was the clinical picture on day 63. On day 14, when Cale Dunmore first sat down beside him, our retrospective modeling suggests the window was closer to 4 days. 4 days. The boy had, by chance or fate or the mountain's particular gravity, sat down next to a creature who had 4 days left. Written account, Cale Dunmore continued. I went back to the settlement that first night. I knew I had to because if I didn't come home, Mum would call the search drones, and I didn't want drones up near the hollow. I wasn't sure why at that point, just a feeling, like the hollow was a private thing and I didn't want to disrupt it. I told Mum I'd stayed late at the ridge doing field work for the school project. She gave me the look, the one where she knows I'm not quite telling the full truth but she's deciding whether to push it. She decided not to that night, made me eat dinner and go to bed. I couldn't sleep. I lay there replaying the conversation, if you can call it that, when the other party speaks in something that isn't exactly sound and trying to figure out what was happening to him, because I knew something was very wrong. I'd understood that from the first moment. The crumbling scales, the irregular breathing, the terminal radiance, I didn't have a name for it then, but I could see it. The light coming up through his surface, beautiful and alarming in equal measure, like a house showing warmth in its windows just before something structural gives way. I got up at about 2 in the morning, got my pack, left a note for Mum that said I was going back to the ridge early for the project. I went back to the hollow. He was awake. I don't know if he'd slept. Maybe he didn't sleep anymore. Maybe he was past that. I sat in the same spot I'd sat before. His eyes were already tracking me when I arrived, which means he'd heard or sensed me coming, from a distance I can't calculate. You returned, he said. I told you I was staying, I said. A pause. You said you would not leave me alone. You left. I had to get dinner, I said, and sleep. I'm 12. The resonance again, that not quite laughter, it lasted longer this time. 12, he said, the way you'd say a number you were trying to understand the scale of. I am 4012. 4,000 times older than me, I said. Yes. That seems hard, I said. A long pause, much longer than the others. It is, he finally said, it is very hard. Oral testimony, Jenna Tola, schoolteacher, Asheville Lower. Recorded by GPA correspondent Surin Oliveth. Cale was absent from school for 3 days before I filed the notice. I didn't file it earlier because his mother had contacted me on day 1 to say he was working on the settlement geography project in the field, and on day 2, she sent another message saying he was extending the field work because he'd found something significant. I didn't know at that point what he'd found. I just thought he was, being a thorough student. He was a thorough student, irritatingly thorough, honestly. The kind who'd turn in 20 pages when you asked for 5 and then look genuinely puzzled when you suggested he edit it down. On day 4, I called his mother directly, and from the way she sounded on the call I could tell that she'd figured out more of what was going on than she was saying. She sounded, not worried, exactly. Something more complicated than worried. She sounded like someone watching their child do something terrifying and necessary at the same time. I found out later that by day 3 she'd followed him, quietly. She didn't go into the hollow, she said later. She could feel something at the rim that made her stop, that she wasn't sure she could describe, and she'd respected the feeling. But she'd seen Cale down there, small against that enormous coiled form, sitting in the same spot, and Ethan with his great head turned just slightly toward the boy. She'd stood at the rim for an hour, she told me. Then she went home. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't report it. She went home, and she started quietly reaching out to people she trusted to ask questions she said she wasn't sure how to ask. How do you help a dying thing that's too big to move? What do you do when something ancient is breaking and you can feel it but you don't have the tools? And she was asking these questions while her 12-year-old son was doing the one thing she'd somehow raised him to do anyway, even without instructions. He was staying. Days 3-9, third moon. I started bringing things. Not I didn't have a plan, I want to be clear. I wasn't thinking strategically. I was thinking the way you think when something needs something and you're trying to figure out what that something is, so you try things. Day 3, I brought a speaker, small portable one. I played music, just the playlists I had on my communicator, a mix of whatever I'd been listening to for the past year, which was eclectic and a bit embarrassing in retrospect. Some of it he didn't react to at all. Some of it the older compositions, some of the traditional folk pieces from the pre-settlement recordings that Mum liked, those made him go very still. Not uncomfortable still, settled still, like something landing. Where does this come from? He asked about one of them. Old Earth tradition, I said. My mum says her grandmother used to sing it. A pause. How old? A few 100 years at least. Young, he said, but he didn't mean it dismissively. He meant it the way you'd look at a seedling and recognize what it would become. Day 5, I started talking, just telling him things, about the settlement, about school, about the marsh crawler I'd rescued when I was 6, which he found interesting in a way I didn't expect. You did not know if it would recover. No, I said. But you stayed. Yeah. A long silence. Why? I thought about it because it needed someone to, and I was there. He didn't say anything for a long time after that. Day 7, something changed. His breathing became more labored. The intervals stretched further. Twice, sitting there watching, I counted past 40 seconds between breaths, and I sat with my hands in fists on my knees, not letting myself move, not letting myself panic, waiting. He always breathed again. After the second long gap, I said, "You have to keep breathing." He said, "I am trying, small one." "Try harder," I said. "You are very demanding for a creature of 12 years. I'm also very persistent," I said. The resonance, softer than before, like something running low on fuel but still generating heat. "Yes," he said, "I have noticed that." Day 8, I brought food for myself and sat there eating it, which probably sounds absurd, but I needed him to understand that I was treating this place as a normal place I was going to be at regularly. I was trying to establish, I don't know exactly what I was trying to establish. Continuity, regularity. I wanted him to know I was going to keep coming back, that this wasn't a single visit out of curiosity. He watched me eat, not hungrily, more like someone watching a practice they've never seen before. "You eat often," he said. 3 times a day usually, I said. "Humans need to." "I have not eaten in 40 years. I almost choked on my food. 40 years, aren't you starving? "The process does not require food at this stage," he said. And from the way he said it, the flatness of it, the matter-of-fact quality, I understood that what he meant was, at this stage, the process doesn't require anything much at all. I put my food down. I sat there for a while. Then I said, "What do you need? Not medically, not food or water or whatever. What do you actually need?" The longest pause. "I do not know," he said. "I have been asking that question for 600 years. "Then let's figure it out together," I said. Testimony: Dr. Ravas Sundarath, Neurological Division, GPA Emergency Response. What we came to understand, eventually, about the Verkite compound and its role in grace-spine physiology, required us to revise several foundational assumptions we'd made about non-humanoid consciousness and its relationship to connection. This is the simplest way I can state it. Verkite is not just a storage compound for memory. It is a transmission medium. Its entire biological function depends on sharing. A grayspine dragon whose Verkite network has no external receiver will, over time, experience what happens to any system in which a transmitter operates indefinitely with no receiver. The signal degrades, and eventually the transmitter fails. Ethan Verk's Verkite network had been transmitting with no receiver for 600 years. The anomaly, and I use the word in its clinical sense, though I'm aware how inadequate it is what we detected beginning approximately on day 6 of Cale Dunmore's visits. There is a small receiver structure in the temporal lobe of several humanoid species, including humans, which developed for reasons we believe have to do with early intraspecies emotional communication. It is vestigial mostly. Humans don't use it consciously. Most of them don't know it exists. But it receives. Not language, not memory in the sequential sense, emotional resonance, amplitude pattern data, the difference between experiencing grief and knowing someone else is grieving, that kind of signal. Cale Dunmore's temporal receiver structure, on the biometric analysis we conducted weeks later, showed activation patterns consistent with sustained, high-intensity Verkite signal reception. His brain had been, without his awareness or the awareness of the dragon, responding. He wasn't just sitting there. He was receiving. Day 11, third moon emergency recording. Note, recording quality severely degraded. Reconstruction approximate. I need to document this. I don't know, I need to say it to someone, even if it's just the recorder. It's about I don't know what time it is. Late, after midnight. I came back because I couldn't sleep and I had a feeling, the chest feeling, but stronger than usual. Much stronger, like something pulling. He's barely breathing. I've been here for 4 hours. I've been counting the intervals. 11 minutes ago the gap was 52 seconds. That's the longest one yet. I counted every second of it. When he breathed again, I started crying. Which is, I know, but I'm also 12 and this is, I can't explain how this feels. Like something very fundamental is in the process of ending, and I'm the only one here and I don't know what to do. I moved closer. I know I shouldn't, but I did. I put my hand on the nearest scale, the ones that haven't crumbled, and it was warm, not hot like I expected. Warm, like touching something that's been in the sun all day. He opened his eyes. Gold in the dark, just those eyes, everything else almost invisible. Small one, he said. I'm here, I said. You should not be here in the dark. You're here in the dark, I said. I have been here in the dark for a very long time. I know, I said, that's why I'm staying. A long silence. His eyes didn't close, but the quality of them changed. Something in the gold deepened, like the difference between a flame holding and a flame burning low. I am carrying things, he said. His voice was different, slower, each word formed with effort. Things that should not end with me. Not because they are great things, only because they happened. They were real. And when something has been real, it should not simply stop. Then tell me, I said, tell me the things. You cannot hold what I carry, small one. I know, I said, but I can hear it, that's something. His breath came, long, trembling slightly at the end. Yes, he said, that is something. And he started to tell me. Classified addendum, GPA Neurological Division. Sealed record, tribunal access only. Release cycle 4887. What occurred between approximately 200 and 5:47 hours on day 12, third moon, is the subject of the sealed portion of this record. We will disclose the following, by order of the Open Records Tribunal. At 2:03 hours, Cale Dunmore's communicator began registering biometric anomalies in the user. Elevated neural activity, specifically in the temporal and frontal lobes. Blood pressure and heart rate consistent with deep emotional engagement rather than fear or physical stress. At 2:17 hours, the communicator registered a signal type it was not designed to detect, and which exists in no GPA database of known emissions. We have since classified it as a Type 7 Verkite broadcast event. It is the first such event ever recorded. In basic terms, Ethan Verk's Verkite network, responding to, we believe, the presence of an active receiver at close range, initiated a partial transmission event. Not full memory download, not the catastrophic release our models would have predicted, something more measured, more deliberate. He chose what to send. The recordings do not capture what Kale received. They capture only the aftermath. A 12-year-old boy sitting in a hollow in the dark, hand against the scale of an ancient dying dragon with tears running down his face, whispering, "I've got it. I've got it. I'm keeping it." We have asked Kale Dunmore many times what he received. He struggles to describe it. He says it was not like watching a film or reading a book. He says it was more like being breathed through. Like his lungs were briefly someone else's lungs, and his eyes were briefly someone else's eyes, and the world he saw through those eyes was older and larger and sadder, and more beautiful than anything he had words for. He says the things he received are still in him. He says he does not expect that to change. He is 14 now, at the time of this filing. His teachers report that he writes with a quality of observation that is unusual for his age. His creative work has a texture to it, a sense of accumulated depth, that some of his instructors describe as reading like someone much older than he is. One of his teachers submitted a note with the student evaluations that we have included in the case record. She said, "It is as though he has memories he didn't earn. He writes about grief the way someone writes who has lived a very long time." I found the hollow on day 12. I'd been tracking him at a distance, not every day but most days by that point. I knew roughly where he was going. I'd started asking around more openly, partly because I needed someone to tell me I wasn't wrong to let him keep going, and partly because Bren Coulter had said something to me that I hadn't been able to shake. She said, "The mountain has been waiting. I don't know what it's been waiting for, but I think your boy might be it." I climbed to the hollow. I didn't stop at the rim this time. I climbed down. Kale was asleep. He'd fallen asleep sitting up, leaning against the scale he'd been touching, head tilted back, breathing slow and even. He looked younger in sleep than he did awake, which is unusual for him. He usually looks older than 12 when he's thinking. In sleep he looked exactly 12. A boy. And Ethan. I need to give me a moment with this part. Ethan's head was lowered. Across the night he'd moved, very slightly, in the slow way that something enormous moves when it doesn't want to disturb anything. His head was maybe 2 meters from where Kale was sleeping, resting at an angle that meant if Kale woke up and turned, Ethan's eye would be level with his. Watching him sleep. The terminal radiance was, I can only describe it as different, still present, still beautiful and alarming, but there was something in the pattern of it that I couldn't have articulated at the time, and which the scientists explained to me later. The Verkite was redistributing, organizing in some sense, less like a fire burning out and more like a fire finding a new kind of fuel. I sat down at the edge of the hollow, and I watched my son sleep next to a dragon. And I thought about all the things I'd tried to teach him, all the explicit lessons, the ones I'd planned, the ones about responsibility and community and treating every creature with the same care you'd want for yourself. And I realized, the ones that had actually taken root were the ones I'd shown him accidentally. By example, by the way I'd handled things when I thought he wasn't watching. He'd learned that you don't leave something alone that needs company. He'd learned it watching me sit with our neighbor when she was sick. He'd learned it from the way his father had handled a frightened animal at the agricultural station where he'd worked before he passed. He'd absorbed it so deeply it had become reflexive. He wasn't trying to save Ethan. He just couldn't leave him. I sat there until Cale woke up about an hour later. He looked at me. Then he looked at Ethan's eye, which was open when had it opened, and watching him. Then he looked back at me. "Hi, Mum," he said. "Hi, love," I said. "This is Ethan," he said. "Ethan, this is my mum." I looked at the dragon, the great gold eye, old as time, still as everything. "Mrs. Dunmore," the presence said, in that way that wasn't sound, "your son is very stubborn." "I know," I said. "He gets it from me." Testimony: Bren Coulter, settlement elder. When word got out, and it was going to get out eventually, these things always do in a small settlement, the response was not what the GPA observers expected. They expected panic, or maybe the kind of detached scientific excitement that outside institutions tend to bring to things like this. They expected the settlement to want to contain it, or control it, or hand it off to authorities who would know what to do. What actually happened was that people started going to the rim. Not into the hollow. Most people respected that this was a private thing, in the way the hollow had always felt private, in the way the mountain had always communicated that it wanted to be left to itself. But they went to the rim. They sat up there and they looked down and they were quiet. Old Vesson, who's been fixing agricultural machinery here for 40 years, and who I have never once heard say anything that wasn't practical and grounded, sat at the rim for 3 hours on day 15, and then came back to the settlement and started building something in his workshop. He wouldn't tell anyone what it was for a week. When he finally showed us, it was a sound amplifier rigged out of salvaged survey equipment that could carry music all the way down into the hollow without anyone having to go in. He said the boy was playing music to it. I thought it might help to have something bigger. He set it up at the rim, and every evening from that point on, someone in the settlement would choose what to play through it. No arguing about what to choose. People just took turns. And every night, the hollow filled with whatever someone had decided to offer. Folk music, old recordings, children singing. Once a group of kids had a long debate and then decided on complete silence for an hour because they thought silence was also something you could give. The dragon was quiet through all of it, but the terminal radiance changed night by night, and not in the direction the scientists would have predicted. Day 28, third moon. Case dossier GPA 7741 marked urgent anomaly. We are filing this joint report because neither of us has the professional language to file it individually without it sounding like something other than a clinical document. At day 28, we conducted a full biometric reassessment of Ethan Verk. We repeat for the record the initial measurements. We want to be very precise about what these numbers mean, because the temptation to offstate this is real and we are resisting it. 31% is not recovery, not for a gracespine dragon. It is not health. It is not viability in the long term. What it is, the only thing it can be, given the trajectory, is stabilization. Something stopped the decline. The Verkite distribution maps, which we had been tracking daily since day 3 of GPA involvement, show a pattern we have not seen in any prior documentation of gracespine physiology, because there is no prior documentation of this situation. The compound, instead of continuing its terminal migration to the surface, the process we know as terminal radiance, has begun a partial redistribution inward. It is not uniform. It is not, as best we can tell, medically directed by any conscious process in the dragon. It is as though the network found something to organize around, an anchor. Our neurological team's assessment is that the anchor is the Verkite broadcast event of day 12. The partial transmission, the pieces of the network that were shared, transmitted to and received by Cale Dunmore, created a distributed node, a point of external connection that the remaining network could orient toward. The compound has something to transmit to again. And so it stopped burning itself out. We are aware of how this sounds. We are aware that it sounds like something from a cultural narrative rather than a clinical report. We considered very carefully how to phrase it before concluding that clarity matters more than clinical distance here. A boy sat next to a dying dragon and refused to leave. His brain, through a vestigial structure no one fully understood, received a partial transmission from the dragon's memory network. And that reception, that tiny external anchor in a vast sea of loneliness, began to reverse a process that our best models said was irreversible. We are not saying this is a miracle. We are saying that our models were incomplete. Testimony Cale Dunmore. Recorded 4 months after initial contact. I didn't know any of the science when it was happening. I found out about the Verkite stuff much later when the GPA scientists explained it to me. I still don't fully understand all of it. I understand the shape of it, which is maybe enough. What I knew in real time was that he was getting stronger. Not dramatically. Not the way people talk about miraculous recoveries in the old stories where someone wakes up healed and the crowd cheers. More like the pauses between his breaths got shorter, and then slightly shorter again, and the crumbling at the edge of his scales stopped advancing, and the terminal radiance, instead of rising higher, surfacing more, seemed to settle, to go back slightly, like water receding. I noticed it before the scientists did, because I was there every day and they weren't. The scientists are great, I don't want to dismiss them, but they had their data and I had just being there, watching him, the way you watch something you've been watching for a long time until you can read the small differences. On day 19, he lifted his head. Not much, maybe 20 degrees from the ground. He'd been keeping it low for so long that even that small lift made the whole hollow feel different. On day 23, he ate something. Not I don't know what the Graceband line eats in health. Whatever it was, I wasn't there for the specifics. But there were signs the next morning, and he looked slightly less like something at the edge of itself. On day 31, when I arrived in the morning, he turned his head toward me from the far side of the hollow, the far side, which he'd never voluntarily moved toward before, and he said, "You are late today." "I had school," I said. "You prioritize the learning institution over." "You're not dying anymore," I said. "You can wait for me." The resonance, full strength, I hadn't heard it full strength before. It hit my sternum like a struck bell. "You are very rude for a creature of 12 years, he said. "You say that every time," I said, "and you're still here." "Yes," he said, "I'm still here." Written age 14, submitted to GPA Archive. People ask me what he taught me, like it's a clean question with a clean answer, like there's a lesson that sits in the center of it and I can just hand it to you. The honest answer is that I'm still figuring it out. I'll probably be figuring it out for a long time, maybe the rest of my life. But I can tell you some of the things. He taught me that the oldest things carry the most weight, and not because they're strong, because they've held on. There's a difference. Strength is a force you apply. Holding on is a choice you keep making. He'd been making it for 4,000 years, and for 600 of those years he'd been making it alone, with the full weight of everything his line had ever known pressing down through him and nowhere to go. He didn't give up because he couldn't make himself stop choosing to hold on, even when holding on was a kind of agony. He taught me that being heard is different from being fixed. I couldn't fix what was happening to him. I was 12, I had a communicator and a portable speaker and some food. I couldn't restore his family. I couldn't rebuild the network. I couldn't make any of the grief go away. But I stayed, and he talked, and something in the simple act of being received, of his signal finding a receiver, even a tiny one, even an unlikely one, was enough to change the direction of something irreversible. I think about that a lot. How much of what breaks in living things breaks because no one is receiving, because the transmission goes out and comes back empty. How much stays held together just because someone decided to sit down and stay. He taught me that 4,000 years is not too old to laugh. That thing he did, the not quite laughter, the resonance in the chest, he did it more and more as he got stronger. Ridiculous things made him do it. I told him about a sheep my father used to keep that hated Tuesdays specifically, just Tuesdays. Every other day was fine, and he made the resonance so loud the scales on the hollow floor rattled. 4,000 years old, and a story about a sheep with a scheduling grievance made him shake. I think about that too. He taught me, this is the one I find hardest to say, because it sounds like a line someone wrote, but I mean it as plainly and concretely as I can manage. He taught me that nothing that has been real simply stops. The Werk is in him. 10,000 years of a civilization that built nothing and needed nothing and simply was, it's in him, and now a small piece of it is in me. Not a stored file, not data, more like a quality, a way of noticing things, a weight behind the eyes when I look at something that has lasted a long time. He gave me something that cannot be lost because I'm carrying it now. And if I live long enough, maybe I'll give pieces of it to someone else. And maybe that's how things survive, not in monuments or archives, though those have their place, but in the altered quality of the people who stayed long enough to receive them. Closing statement. Senior Archivist Tessivorn Quelleth. I have filed a lot of documents in my career. I have closed a lot of cases. This one has taken me longer to close than any other in my 31 years with the authority, and not because of any procedural complexity. It's taken me long because I keep coming back to one moment in the footage. Day 12, 2:03 hours. A 12-year-old human boy in a dark hollow, hand on a scale that has lasted 4,000 years, saying, "I've got it. I'm keeping it." He didn't know what he was keeping. He couldn't. He didn't know the science. He didn't know the scope. He just felt something coming through and decided to hold on. That's the story in the end. That's the whole story. A dragon was dying. A boy refused to let him die alone. And somewhere in the ancient machinery of two very different kinds of life, touching across the distance of everything that separated them, something clicked into place that our best minds had said couldn't click. He's still alive, Ethan Werk. Still in the hollow, though he moves around it more freely now. His cardiovascular output as of last assessment is at 58% of baseline. The terminal radiance has receded. The crumbling has stopped. The scales that fell are being slowly, painstakingly, the way 4,000-year-old biology does everything, replaced. He is not young. He will not be young again. He will never be what he was before the Werk fractured. The loneliness of 600 years does not simply reverse. Some damage is too old to unmake. But he is alive. And Cale Dunmore visits twice a week, on average, between school and whatever project currently has his attention. He brings music. He brings food that he eats while Ethan watches with the particular interest of someone who finds the smallness of biological needs both baffling and, somehow, endearing. They talk for hours. About old things and new things and the very large space between. About the settlement and the mountain and the nature of memory. About a sheep that hated Tuesdays. About what it means to hold on when holding on is the only thing left. I asked Cale once, just before the tribunal closed the active record, if he thought he'd saved Ethan. He thought about it for a while. He does that, thinks for longer than you'd expect before he answers, and the answer is usually worth the wait. He said, "I don't think I saved him. I think he saved himself. He kept breathing right, every interval, every 52-second gap. He always breathed again." He paused. I just made sure he knew someone was counting.